Snow had begun to fall before sundown, not the gentle kind that softened the land, but the thin, cutting flakes that felt like needles against skin and turned the muddy street of Red Willow, crossing into a frozen scar. Christmas Eve meant nothing here. The town did not glow with candles or ring with hymns. It crouched under the weight of winter. Wooden buildings hunched like old men, their roofs leaking smoke that smelled of wet pine and desperation. At the far end of the street, behind a laundry shed that leaned as if ashamed of itself, a young Chinese woman sat on a sack of broken rice husks, her hands tucked beneath her sleeves, her stomach empty since the morning before. Her name was Lin Xiaoyue, though no one in Red Willow Crossing had ever bothered to learn it. To them she was just another China bride, shipped across the ocean and sold into a life that promised work but delivered hunger. The man who had bought her had died 2 months earlier, collapsed in the mud behind the saloon, whiskey freezing on his beard before dawn, and with his death, whatever thin protection she had vanished. The boarding house keeper let her sleep in the laundry shed only because she scrubbed clothes until her fingers split and bled, and even then, food was never guaranteed. Tonight there was none at all. Xiaoyue pressed her tongue against the roof of her mouth to ignore the ache, listening to laughter spill from the saloon, the sound sharp and cruel as broken glass. She wondered if her mother, far across the sea in Guangdong, still lit incense on nights like this, whispering prayers for a daughter she believed married and safe. A gust of wind slipped through the cracks in the shed wall, lifting Xiaoyu's thin cotton jacket. She closed her eyes and told herself she would survive the night, as she had survived others quietly and visibly, without asking for mercy from a place that had none to give. That was when the sound of hooves cut through the noise of the town. Slow and deliberate, not the hurried clatter of a drunk riding home, but the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Heads turned. Even the saloon door creaked open as laughter faltered. A tall bay horse stepped into the lamplight, steam rolling from its nostrils, and astride it sat a gunslinger with a long coat dusted white at the shoulders. His hat brim was pulled low, shadowing his eyes, but the scar along his jaw caught the light, an old, pale line that spoke of survival paid for in blood. His name was Caleb Rourke, though in towns like this, his name was rarely spoken aloud. People knew him by other things: the way his right hand never strayed far from the revolver at his hip, the fact that he did not drink, the fact that men who crossed him tended to leave town quickly or not at all. He dismounted without haste, tied his horse, and stood for a moment as if listening to the air itself. Then his gaze moved unerringly to the shadow behind the laundry shed. Xiaoyu felt it before she saw him, the strange weight of being noticed after months of being ignored. She opened her eyes and met his stare. He did not leer, did not smirk. His expression was unreadable, almost stern, as if he were looking at something that did not fit where it had been placed. He took a step closer, boots sinking into the half-frozen mud. "You'll freeze sitting there," he said at last, his voice low and rough, shaped by dust and distance. Xiaoyue did not answer. English still felt like a borrowed coat that never quite fit, and besides, experience had taught her that speaking often made things worse. She bowed her head slightly, a reflex she could not unlearn. The gunslinger's eyes flicked to her hands, red and swollen to the hollow at her cheeks. The saloon door slammed behind him as someone inside laughed too loudly, trying to pretend nothing had changed. Caleb Rourke looked back toward the light, then down at the woman again. Snow settled on his shoulders, unmoving. "Get up," he said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that allowed no argument. Xiaoyu's heart stuttered. Orders from men usually meant pain or humiliation. Slowly, stiff with cold and fear, she rose. For a moment they stood facing each other. Two lives from opposite ends of the world meeting in the mud on Christmas Eve. Then the gunslinger spoke the words that would split her life cleanly in two. "You're coming home." The words did not make sense to her at first. Home was a memory of warm rain on tiled roofs, of rice steaming in clay pots, of her father's hands, rough from fieldwork but gentle when he braided her hair. Red Willow Crossing had never been home, only a place she endured. Xiaoyu stood there, snow settling into her hair, unsure whether to move or wait for the meaning to become clear. The man, Caleb Rourke, turned without looking back, already walking toward his horse as if the matter was settled. He stopped only when he realized she had not followed. He glanced over his shoulder, impatience flashing briefly across his face. Then something else, something like restraint. "I ain't asking twice," he said, not raising his voice. Around them, the town seemed to hold its breath. A few faces peered from windows. Someone muttered a curse from the saloon. No one intervened. No one ever did when it came to people like her. Xiaoyu took a step, then another, her legs trembling from cold and hunger. Each movement felt like walking out onto thin ice. But she followed because the alternative was staying where she was. And staying had nearly killed her already. Caleb helped her mount without touching more than necessary, steadying the horse with one hand while she clutched the saddle horn, awkward and unaccustomed. He swung up behind her, the heat of his body a startling contrast to the frozen air. She stiffened instinctively, but he kept a careful distance, reins loose in his hands. The horse turned away from the town, hooves splashing through ruts filled with blackened slush. As they rode, the lights of Red Willow Crossing faded behind them, swallowed by falling snow. Xiaoyu did not look back. She had learned long ago that nothing waited for her there. The road, or what passed for one, was little more than a ribbon of churned mud and ice, winding through scrub and bare cottonwoods. The night pressed in close, broken only by the sound of the horse's breathing and the creak of leather. After a long while, hunger sharpened into dizziness, and Xiaoyu's grip faltered. She swayed, a soft sound escaping her throat. Caleb caught it immediately. He reined in and slid from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. Without a word, he reached into his coat and produced a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He hesitated, then held it out to her. Inside was a piece of hard bread and a strip of dried meat. Simple and unremarkable, but to Xiaoyu it might as well have been gold. Her hands shook as she took it. "Eat," he said. She did, slowly, forcing herself not to devour it all at once. The food burned going down, her stomach cramped in protest. But warmth followed, fragile and precious. Caleb watched her without comment, eyes scanning the darkness as if danger might rise from the snow itself. When she finished, he took the empty cloth, nodded once, and helped her back onto the horse. They rode again, and this time she leaned forward slightly, exhaustion stealing her fear. After what felt like hours, a faint glow appeared ahead, steady and low. A cabin emerged from the trees, squat and solid, smoke curling from its chimney. It was not large, but it stood firm against the wind, a lone claim of warmth in a hostile land. Caleb dismounted and lifted her down, setting her on her feet as if she weighed nothing at all. He led her to the door, opened it and motioned her inside. Heat rushed over her, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something faintly sweet. A small Christmas wreath, nothing more than pine branches tied with twine, hung above the hearth. Xiaoyu stared at it, stunned. No one had marked the season for her since she left China. Caleb hung his coat, stoked the fire, and set a pot to warm. His movements efficient, practiced. Only then did he turn to her. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. "No one's going to bother you." His tone left no room for doubt. Xiaoyu lowered herself onto a stool near the fire, heat seeping into her bones. She did not know why he had brought her here or what price he would eventually demand. She only knew that for the first time in months, she was not cold and she was not alone. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the road back to Red Willow Crossing, as if erasing the path she had taken to get there. The cabin settled into silence once the wind eased, the kind of quiet that pressed close but did not threaten. Flames snapped softly in the hearth, throwing amber light across rough-hewn walls and a single, narrow table scarred by years of use. Xiaoyu sat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup Caleb had placed before her. Inside, warm broth steamed thin but real, and the smell made her eyes sting with something dangerously close to tears. She drank carefully, each swallow steadying her. Caleb remained across the room, leaning against the wall near the door, his presence solid but distant. as if he were guarding a boundary he did not intend to cross. When she finished, he took the cup and rinsed it at a basin, then set it aside. Only then did he speak again. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered softly, shaping the words with care. "Lin Xiaoyue." He repeated it once, slowly, as though committing it to memory. "I'm Caleb Rourke." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb reached beneath the table and pulled out a folded blanket. Worn but clean, he set it on the narrow bed against the far wall. "You can sleep," he said. "Door'll be barred." Xiaoyu stood, uncertain, and bowed her head slightly in thanks. As she lay down, the blanket heavy and warm over her, exhaustion finally overtook fear. Her eyes closed, but her mind drifted half awake, listening to the rhythm of the fire and the muted sounds of Caleb moving about the cabin. She realized dimly that he had taken the chair by the door, not the bed. The night deepened. Outside, a branch cracked under the weight of snow, and Xiaoyu startled awake, heart racing. Before she could sit up, Caleb's voice came low and steady from the darkness. "It's just the wind," she exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of embers. Christmas Eve passed without bells or prayers, but in that small cabin, something shifted all the same. When dawn crept pale and grey through the frost-rimmed window, Xiaoyu woke to the smell of coffee, bitter, strong, unfamiliar. Caleb stood at the hearth, back to her, hat resting on the table. He did not turn until she stirred. "Morning," he said simply. He set a small plate before her, bread warmed by the fire, a spoonful of beans. It was not much, but it was more than she had been given in weeks. She ate while he saddled the horse outside, movements visible through the window. When he returned, coat on and revolver buckled, his expression was set, resolved. "You ain't going back to that town," he said. "Not ever." Xiaoyu looked up at him, confusion and cautious hope tangling in her chest. "Where?" she began, the word faltering. Caleb met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Somewhere better," he replied. He opened the door, letting cold air rush in, but behind it lay open land and a road leading away from everything she had known. Xiaoyu rose, heart pounding, and stepped toward the light. She did not know what waited beyond the trees, or why this gunslinger had chosen her on a frozen Christmas Eve. She only knew that she was walking forward, and that, for the first time since leaving her homeland, the future did not feel like a closed door. They rode east with the sun at their backs, the land opening wide and unforgiving, a stretch of frozen grass and low hills that looked empty, until one understood how easily emptiness could kill. Xiaoyu sat straighter now, her body slowly remembering strength as warmth and food returned in small, careful portions. Caleb set a steady pace, never pushing the horse too hard, stopping when the light began to thin or when the wind rose sharp enough to cut through cloth. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were plain and honest, never wasted. He pointed out landmarks, a split boulder shaped like a broken tooth, a stand of cottonwoods that marked a shallow creek, and she listened, committing them to memory as if the land itself were teaching her how to survive. By the third day, she realized something quietly astonishing. He was not leading her to another town. Each night they stopped far from settlements, making camp where smoke would not be seen easily, where the ground offered some shelter from the wind. Once, as dusk fell purple and cold, she finally found the courage to ask the question that had burned in her since. "Christmas morning. Why me?" The words came out barely louder than the wind. Caleb did not answer right away. He finished tying the horse, tested the knot, then sat on a fallen log, elbows resting on his knees. "I've seen what towns do to folks who don't fit," he said at last. "I seen it up close." He looked at his hands as if they carried old ghosts. "Didn't sit right leaving you there?" Xiaoyu absorbed this in silence. In her experience, kindness always came with conditions, spoken or not. She waited for the rest, for the demand. It did not come. Instead, the days stretched on, measured by hoofbeats and the slow arc of the sun. They crossed a river crusted with ice, the horse picking its way carefully while water whispered dark and dangerous beneath. They skirted a burned-out homestead where only a stone chimney remained, standing like a marker for dreams that had failed. At night, Caleb cleaned his revolver methodically, movements precise, eyes alert, even as he pretended calm. Xiao Yue began to notice scars beneath his sleeves, old and pale, telling stories he did not speak aloud. One evening, as they shared a pot of beans near a low fire, distant voices drifted across the plain, men laughing, time layered with the smells of stew and bread. She did not know what trials awaited her here, but she sensed that this valley marked a turning point. The world had not grown kinder overnight, but for the first time, it had opened a door instead of slamming one shut. Life in the valley did not soften for her all at once. It unfolded cautiously, like a hand slowly unclenching. The cabin belonged to Margaret Hale, but the land beyond it had been claimed and half-tamed by Caleb years earlier, before the weight of his past had driven him into the wandering life of a gunslinger. Xiao Yue learned this in fragments, the way one learns truths that are too heavy to be delivered whole. Days settled into a rhythm shaped by necessity rather than cruelty. She rose before dawn, helping Margaret knead bread or carry water from the creek, her breath ghosting white in the cold air. Her hands ached, but it was a clean ache, one that promised strength instead of depletion. Caleb spent his mornings repairing fences or splitting wood, his movements economical, his attention always drifting to the tree line as if he expected the land itself to betray him. Sometimes he rode out alone, returning by dusk with snow on his coat and eyes darker than before. Xiao Yue did not ask where he went. She understood silence as a language. Margaret, however, spoke freely, her voice steady as she taught Xiao Yue how to use unfamiliar tools, how to read the sky for weather, how to salt meat properly so it would last through winter. She never asked where Xiao Yue came from or why she had arrived with Caleb, and that restraint felt like a gift. At night, they sat by the fire, and Margaret told stories of the valley, of hard winters survived, of neighbors lost, of the land's stubborn refusal to yield easily. Xiao Yue listened, absorbing each word, finding herself slowly included, in a world that did not demand she erase who she was. Yet danger crept even into this quiet place. One afternoon, while Margaret and Xiao Yue hung laundry stiff with frost, hoofbeats echoed. From the ridge, 3 riders emerged, their silhouettes sharp against the pale sky. Caleb was at the fence line in an instant, rifle in hand, his posture changing from farmer to something older and deadlier. The riders approached openly, too openly, and Xiao Yue felt a familiar knot of fear tighten in her chest. When they reined in, their leader grinned, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Heard you were back in these parts, Rourke," the man drawled. "Heard you picked up yourself a little. Chinese bride along the way." Xiao Yue froze. Margaret stepped forward, her presence calm but unyielding. "This is my land," she said coolly. "State your business or leave." The man laughed, spitting into the snow. "Just curious," he said. "Town's been talking?" Caleb's voice cut through the air, low and final. "You heard wrong." His hand rested near his weapon, and the silence stretched taut as wire. At last, the riders backed off, turning their horses with muttered curses. As they vanished over the ridge, Xiao Yue realized she was shaking. That night she could not sleep. Memories of Red Willow Crossing clawed at her, whispers of how quickly safety could dissolve. She rose and stepped outside, the cold biting but familiar. The valley lay quiet under moonlight. Caleb sat on the porch, rifle across his knees. He did not look surprised to see her. "They won't come back," he said, though his eyes never left the darkness. "You don't know that," she replied softly. It was the most she had spoken to him in days. He glanced at her then, something like regret crossing his face. "I know the kind of men they are," he said, "and I know what they fear." She studied him. The scars, the guarded stillness. "And what do you fear?" The question hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Caleb exhaled slowly. "That the past always catches up," he said. Snow began to fall again, light and quiet. Xiao Yue wrapped her arms around herself, then hesitated before sitting beside him on the porch step. They watched the valley together, 2 people bound by survival, waiting to see whether this fragile peace could hold Winter tightened its hold. But the valley endured. Snow buried the ground deep enough that sound itself seemed muffled, as though the world had drawn a blanket over its own wounds. Days passed without riders on the ridge. Yet Caleb remained vigilant, rising before dawn to check tracks, scanning the tree line as if the land whispered warnings only he could hear. Xiao Yu continued her work beside Margaret, her body growing stronger, her spirit steadier. She began to hum softly as she kneaded dough or scrubbed the floor, melodies from home that had once felt too painful to remember. Margaret never commented, only listened, her expression thoughtful, as though she understood that healing often announced itself in small, quiet ways. One evening, as the year waned toward its end, the tension finally broke. Shots rang out from the far ridge, 3 sharp cracks that echoed across the valley like a challenge. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. "Stay inside," he ordered, voice leaving no room for argument. Xiao Yu watched from the window as he moved with grim certainty, disappearing into the trees. Fear coiled in her chest, cold and familiar. She remembered men who promised safety and vanished, leaving her to bear the cost. Minutes stretched, then hours. At last, a single figure emerged from the snowfall. Caleb returned alone, blood darkening his sleeve, his jaw set. Margaret rushed to tend the wound, her hands steady, practiced. "It's done," Caleb said quietly. "They won't trouble this valley again." He did not elaborate, and no one asked. That night, as the fire burned low, Xiao Yu finally spoke the truth she had been carrying. "I thought home was something I lost forever," she said, her voice barely above the crackle of embers. Caleb met her gaze, something unguarded flickering there. "Home ain't always where you start," he replied. "Sometimes it's where you're allowed to stay. The days that followed were brighter, though winter still ruled the land." Caleb's wound healed slowly, leaving another scar to join the rest. He stayed now, no longer riding out alone without explanation. The valley became a place of shared labor and shared meals, of quiet trust built plank by plank. On Christmas morning, 1 year after, the night he had found her hungry and forgotten, Xiao Yu stepped outside the cabin to see the valley bathed in pale sunlight. Margaret stood beside her, pressing a small wrapped parcel into her hands. Inside lay a simple jade pendant worn smooth with age. "It belonged to a woman who survived more than she should have," Margaret said gently. Xiao Yu closed her fingers around it, overwhelmed. Caleb joined them, carrying a bundle of pine branches. Together they tied them above the door, a humble wreath marking survival rather than celebration. Xiao Yu looked from the wreath to the men and women who now stood with her. She understood then that the gunslinger's words on that frozen Christmas Eve had not been a command, but an invitation to leave hunger behind, to step into a life claimed by choice rather than force. Snow fell lightly, not cruel this time, and Xiao Yue breathed deeply, her heart full. She had come home, not to the land she left, but to the one that finally let her belong.